How are we going? It's 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Are we okay? We're exhausted. We are. We're all so exhausted, but we're going to make it through. We're going to make it through by talking about the hellish future we're about to embark on. What a great Thursday afternoon discussion topic. So I'm not going to take up 10 of the 30 minutes I have talking about my career background. Safe to say I'm in community management terms ancient. I'd love to chat, if you want to chat about my background later on, I'm more than happy to do that. I'm going to spend the time talking about community management and communities in general instead. So, in order to understand where we're going, we've got to kind of understand where we're at currently. So at first, we're gonna set up the scene. We're gonna understand what's going on. In order to kind of understand it truly, we're gonna look at some community theory in general. I think part of understanding the problem at hand is understanding the whys behind community management in general. I refuse to elaborate on this part. You're going to find out when we get there. And then we're going to end on a slightly hopeful note because I'm not going to ruin your entire days. So we're going to talk about some things that we can do about the apocalypse that's coming. So I'm really, really sorry to anybody who has come into this talk expecting a happy future. If you have spent any time on the internet whatsoever, you probably predicted this was like a dystopian nightmare conversation. I think in the year 2020, they ran a survey of community managers in the industry, and 60% of them had said their jobs had become overwhelmingly difficult. When I talked to my community manager pals about that, they're like, only 60? I also saw a survey where 70% of the industry has experienced toxicity or they had witnessed it firsthand. And my reaction was, only 70? I think the fact that we all collectively understand that toxicity is a problem, it goes without saying, but I think the fact that we've accepted it as a fact is something that's really worth looking into and it's really worth being concerned about. So the TLDR of this is, I think our community managers have become human meat shields, for lack of a better word. And you know, the dystopian future that I'm talking about, it's kind of already here. You know, maybe we can make it better, but it's actually going to require an understanding of what's happening right now and where we're at right now, so that we can understand how to fix what's broken. Let's do that. So I'm not going to spend too long on this slide because I think that this is a resource that people can actually find for themselves. CMX Hub is a wonderful resource for community managers everywhere, and it's really where I got a lot of my start in understanding community theory. But this is the commitment curve. Just going to take a quick sip of water. All right, so the idea is over time, a member of a community's level of commitment is going to go up. And in turn, so are their actions as well. So early on, when you've just joined a community, you're going to be taking low-effort actions. You're just going to be consuming. And then eventually, over time, the idea is as you become more engaged within that community, you're going to go up and become more engaged and have more commitment. So right at the beginning, you've obviously got aware. You know, maybe they just browse Reddit forums and they're looking at things. They know who you are, but there's not much more than that going on. And then right up the top, you've got advocate, also known as a super fan or a whale or whatever you want to call them. You know, they're really contributing, you know, with user-generated content. They're contributing with big-level conversations. As a community manager, the way to boil down someone's role as a community manager is to pull people up this funnel. You'll notice there's the flip side of this commitment curve. Disinterested, which is, you know, it's pretty natural. That's going to happen here and there. And then you've got detractors. We've got lots of names for detractors. I'm going to leave it up to you and your imagination to think of the best word for detractor. This is a TLDR if you don't like graphs, but you learn through memes. This is how I personally learn. So now we've kind of understood the commitment curve, but how do we actually get people to become advocates? How does that process actually happen? And that's through something called the engagement cycle. So really good because it's actually a cycle. Sometimes I see things that aren't cycles and I'm like, that doesn't make sense. But the idea is in order for a member to feel a strong sense of community and be really aligned within their community, they're going to cycle through these 4 stages repeatedly. And every time they cycle through that stage, it's going to make them more committed to the community. So they're going up that curve by completing this cycle. Every single time they do that, the intensity of the cycle is going to increase. They're going to be taking higher action each time they go through it. The thing that I find really interesting about community management in general is this is actually a natural behavior cycle. This is not something that we're creating ourselves. Certainly community managers will do things to help that cycle move along. And I'll take you through each one step by step, and you'll see where the points are where community managers tend to plug in. But this is natural. This is happening every day in any communities that are formed, both digitally and not digitally. It's part of who we are as people. But let's break down the stages one at a time. So first we have identity. The idea with this one is the member's identity is going to align with the identity of the community. So when someone decides to join a new community, easiest one is, let's say they're a Fallout fan and they want to join a Fallout community. Seeing a community that's signposted in a way that aligns with how they see themselves is going to be why they join. After they join, over time, it's really interesting because the identity of the individual is going to start to conform with the identity of the community as a whole. The easiest way to see when that's starting to happen is when people say we instead of I and things like that. They're going to become way more likely to defend and advocate and participate within a community if it's really strongly aligned with their personal sense of identity. And, if you think about the super fans that you already have in your communities, you know this to be true. This is already happening. And then we have trust. So the idea of this is the member develops trust in other members and also the community as a whole. I think this one's really interesting because it's in the community as a whole, but it's also in specific members of a community. And they both fuel each other. So when someone first presented with the opportunity to participate, they're often brought in by someone who they know and trust already, or they see that there are prominent people within that community that are already there that they trust and understand. And maybe they see the interactions in that community at a face level and they go, yes, this makes sense, this is the kind of content I want to see or I want to be a part of, or whatever it is they may be. I think that the trust comes from the reputation of the community itself or from existing trust of the people within it. We throw words like legitimacy and authenticity and genuine around all the time. And all of those words and all of those actions really boil down to the idea of trust within a community. And if they don't have those things, this is how a lot of people are becoming deterred from being a part of a community. Then we've got engagement. So it's also called participation, depending on what kind of community theory you're looking at. But the idea is that they're taking some sort of action. They're participating in some way. And you can't have a community without this, obviously. I think it's interesting as well because you can't have a community without having different levels of participation as well. If you had a community full of people that were just consuming and not actually creating content or being a part of things in a really active way, then you're not going to see a lot of engagement. And similarly, if you have a community full of advocates, you're not going to have many people consuming in low-level ways, which actually helps to grow a community. As people become more engaged, as per the commitment curve, obviously the kind of engagement they're going to be doing is going to become more and more intense over time. So you start off, I think I said reading Reddit posts, and then you go on up to streaming a game on Twitch. That's obviously different levels of engagement. And then finally, you've got reward. So the idea of this one is that the member gets value from their participation and it makes them want to experience it again. And this is the last stage in the cycle, and it's the most important one as well. It's what actually makes it a cycle, because Reward actually releases dopamine in our brains, tells our body that it was a really good experience, makes us want to do it again. The reward's actually reinforcing the identity, and it also makes us trust things more, which obviously drives us to create more engagement because we know we'll get more rewards in the future. Typically, the kinds of rewards that you see within a community can be both intrinsic and extrinsic. And that's, spoiler alert, really important. Write that down. Things like swag, things like points Facebook has just rolled out for groups. Those are examples of extrinsic rewards. And then you've got intrinsic rewards, like a sense of belonging, status within a community, nice feelings, etc. Both of them do have a role within a community, but reward as a whole is definitely the most important step here. So I participate in a lot of more broad community management industry events, and whenever I'm participating in them, a lot of other community managers from other industries will come up to me and talk to me about how the games industry has the vanguard in terms of community management, how we've always been a few steps ahead of everybody, how we've always really been on the top of trends and how to develop things. And I think, yes, obviously we have a stack of really, really talented community managers in this industry, but I also think it goes beyond that. And I think that it's because the mechanism of games themselves have been built in with identity and reward as part of, from the very beginning, the underlying concepts of games themselves. So it makes so much sense that once you're building communities on those things, your communities are going to be supercharged. So one of the things that I started seeing pretty early on in my career was the more heavily engaged a community was, you saw a huge increase in the amount of detractors that existed. And at first, I was of the opinion that it really just boiled down to the product itself. I've worked on games that came out, didn't do very well, had a lot of people hating on them. I think we've all been there, we've all seen detractors, and I thought that it was a certain level of inevitability. But then I kind of saw a counterpoint to that, in that Sherlock Holmes actually became the counterpoint. In the 1800s, Arthur Conan Doyle actually killed off Holmes. I'm not sure what that noise is, but it sounds ominous. So anyway, Holmes got killed off, and the fans of Sherlock Holmes were devastated. They rallied together. They wore black armbands on the streets. They wrote eulogies for Holmes and sent them as complaint letters to the editor. Like, they went absolutely ballistic. 20,000 people canceled their subscriptions. And eventually they retconned it and brought Holmes back, obviously. And I think that that was one of the first examples of a community really showing detractor behavior, and it kind of really went beyond just it being a bad product. It's also interesting to see how similar communities operate these days. So I moved towards more looking at it as like a sliding scale, like I've got up here. So the more people care, the more likely they are to hate. And therefore, it's inevitable that you'll see more detractors when you have lots of people loving your product. But over the past few months, I've actually kind of thought about that more deeply, and it doesn't actually answer the question of why. It kind of goes, yeah, cool, well, that's a thing, I guess, that we've got lots of people that like it, therefore lots of people that hate it. But why? It doesn't make sense. What I've come to the conclusion of is it's ultimately an identity promise that has gone unfulfilled. So identity misalignment is where I really think it boils down to in terms of people becoming detractors. So this is completely unrelated to community management in its entirety. This is something called the Gartner hype cycle. Has anyone heard of it? Few people? Okay, cool. So this is all about the adoption of new technology, and again, nothing really to do with community management whatsoever. But I find it interesting how you can see similarities in the way that communities are behaving, because at the end of the day, it's all just human behavior. So you start off with initial hype, so inflated expectations. Someone's like, this is really cool, I love this is awesome. And then you get a huge dip once people realize their expectations aren't aligning with reality. And what you see with tech adoption that we're not seeing in communities is you have this slope of enlightenment, which is the most video game sounding shit ever, but that's fine. You understand the purpose of the technology. You understand why it's there. You have a better understanding of how it can help you. And then you move into a plateau of productivity, which again, sounds hilarious. So what I think, taking that model, this is how I see communities. So you still see that peak based on that really high engagement, that initial, oh man, this is really cool, this is hype, I want to get involved, this community looks great. But then you see identity misalignment of people being like, this doesn't serve the needs that I thought it was going to serve, because it's impossible, right? You can't have a group of 800,000 people that all have different identities and have those identity needs met. And suddenly you start to see conflict. So typically you see people becoming attracted to a group because it appears to fulfill their identity needs, and that identity creates that strong engagement, and that those identity engagement go hand in hand. Eventually it becomes too big, too many different expectations. You start to see people withdrawing. At the best case scenario, it's withdrawal, but what we've all seen is toxicity. It's people causing drama with each other, it's people calling other people out, it's people being upset at the mods for overreaching or underreaching or whatever it is may be. So I wanted to find an example of this happening in communities digitally. And I wanted to kind of be as broad as possible. And luckily for me, the year 2020, we all went a little bit insane. And there was a group that started called a group where we all pretend to be ants in an ant colony. Please note the 1.8 million members. 2020 was a wild ride. So the idea of a group where we all pretend to be ants in an ant colony is you pretend to be an ant. Someone will post something ant-related, and people will respond the way that I imagine an ant would on the internet. So you do things like bite, dig, lift, and that's it. There's no other way that you engage. That's all it is. And you think, surely something like this couldn't create drama? You'd be wrong. All of a sudden, there were BuzzFeed articles. Everyone was like, huh, this is hilarious. Hype rose. 1.8 million people joined the group. All of a sudden, they were doing raids on other shitposting groups, and so they'd go into the Marvel fan club and start saying, lift, bite, and people would be like, what is happening? But suddenly, there were all these people with different political backgrounds, different interests entirely, all grouped together under a very flimsy identity connection. It was really reaching. Suddenly, there was drama across the board. Mods were accused of overreaching. Mods were accused of underreaching. People were really upset about a lot of different things because their personal identity needs weren't being met. Tale as old as time, the ants became racist somehow. Splinter groups formed. Suddenly there were like fire ant colonies where they were like, all we do is bite and that's it. It was a lot. There was a lot of stuff happening, but again, you're seeing this cycle in action. Toxicity was pulling in. Suddenly there's about 10 different ant colony groups that you can join on Facebook currently. None of them are great. I'm going to be really honest. So controversial, away from ants for a second. As a community manager, like I said earlier, games were kind of looked at as the vanguard of community management. But what I was starting to see over the past couple of years is I was seeing Web3 games and games communities with these insanely high engagement numbers. And all of these people were like really dedicated to their respective platforms. They had these discords that were just insanely organized. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, not really a big fan of Web3, but I really want to understand why they have such supercharged communities. And so I joined. It lasted 6 months, but I understood the problem. I don't think that it's the problem, but I think that it's a really good symptom of what is happening collectively to our industry right now. I think the thing to be really thoughtful of and mindful of as we go on here is thinking about Web3 as an extension of how our communities are forming. So the game that I worked on when I was at the Web3 company, the way that it worked is we separated players out into different categories. The players themselves, and then earners, and then investors. So there was like 3 different categories, and it was very curious because the players themselves sorted themselves into those categories too. We were then treating our communities as if we would in a traditional company. So we would have the advocates that we would talk to, and we would have special connections with. But those people were also investors. And so it was really, really interesting from a community perspective. The problem that I began to see was the reason that these communities were so supercharged was because there was extrinsic reward involved. So these earners and these investors were in Web3 communities because they saw speculative value. Interestingly, during my time there, I saw entire marketing strategies being built with the communities themselves being the product that they were building. And so community teams were among the most important to a Web3 company, because essentially if your community wasn't engaged and wasn't rallying behind your game or your product, the value of that game was essentially nothing. I want to take a step back for a second though, because we like to look at Web3 as, oh, this is an extrinsic value problem, but it's happening right now in our games. If you look at even simple thing like an emote, back in the day of mud dungeons, emoticons were this useful tool that you could use in order to communicate with other people. But now we're selling them as part of subscription packages on Twitch. It's being something that extrinsic value is not just a Web3 thing. It's happening right now with all of us. But yeah, back to NFT game projects being only as valuable as the engagement of the community around it. Can anybody begin to predict what I started to see while I was at my time as in community at Web3? No one? All right, let's go. So this is that commitment curve that I showed you earlier. And this is what it looks like in Web3 communities. So I worked on the Fallout 76 launch in the community team at Bethesda. And my time, 6 months at the Web3 community, was infinitely worse than the worst day at Fallout 76's launch. Every single day, the detractors not only were unhappy because they had identity misalignment, but also the value that they'd put in and the money that they'd spent wasn't seeing speculative returns. And they weren't seeing outcomes from the money that they had invested. And so it became way more than just game shit, I hate you. It was, you're also not making me the money that I was promised. So let's take a step back. So we're increasingly building our communities based on one thing. So for Web3, it's reward, it's that extrinsic value. For a lot of us in the games industry, it's fandom, it's identity. We're building our entire communities based on that and that alone. And no purpose for the communities exist other than creating a fandom for fandom's sake, or even worse, for commercial outcomes. Engagement means more eyeballs for the algorithm, which means more impressions, which means more sales conversions. We're having community teams that are sat within marketing teams that have KPIs of needing to extract value from our communities. We need to get the money and return on investment. Anytime we use extrinsic motivation as a motivator, it's supercharging this cycle. It's making things move way faster. And we do what's fast. We do what gets us the biggest results the quickest, because that's what makes sense. But what I think this ultimately means is that we're not building any of our communities for trust at all. It's just not necessary. When you don't have trust, You have communities that are not just toxic, but they're built to be toxic. Toxicity is the underlying tone. So we've seen this commodification happen as a way to legitimize community management as a whole. I remember when I first started justifying my job in the first place, I was thinking, look at all this engagement, look at all this awesome hype that we're receiving. But I think what I'm seeing with the identity misalignment cycle, it's happening to our broader digital industry at large. And I know that I came here to talk about the future of community management, but I'm actually not a fortune teller. I don't know for sure. But what I can say is it's already not good, and it's probably going to get worse. We've tried to shortcut and commodify what's supposed to be natural human behavior and a natural human cycle, and we've tried to make it commodified, and it's come at the cost of trust within our communities. So looking at that cycle again, I think I've worked it out. I think I've worked out what we can be doing. I believe our communities are actually missing a key step, and that's purpose. If our communities were actually built around purpose, suddenly identity misalignment isn't quite the devastating blow that it would have been otherwise, because we've built in the slope of purpose, which I think is very fitting. It negates that spiral into toxicity somewhat. I'm going to show a case study because I feel like case studies are more important. And I'm about to reveal myself here as an Australian. Apologies in advance. So this is my favorite Facebook community of all time. It's Snake Identification Australia. Instead of being a group built around fandom, i.e. Snake Appreciation Australia or whatever it would be, it's what I like to call a purpose-led community. And it has a singular purpose: identify the snakes. So this is how it works. You're set up as either an approved idea or a non-approved idea. You're one of the two things. When you first join, every comment you post, you have to say who you are, basically. You can go in, people will post photos of a snake and go, hey, what snake is this? You can guess as a non-approved idea. You can be like, I think it's an eastern brown snake, hashtag non-approved idea. And then you'll have somebody, trust-wise, that'll come in as an approved idea and say what it really is. From an engagement perspective, you've got two types of people. People that just appreciate snakes and think they're cool. A lot of people that are afraid of them and want to get rid of their fear. But then in terms of the snake appreciation factor, they've got a big old group of people that are snake nerds that love to talk about snakes. They've got their own little group chat where they talk about the ins and outs of snakes. From a reward perspective, there's two different types, and they're both intrinsic, very important. My favorite reward in the world is when you guess a snake as a non-approved idea, and then your guess was accurate and you are a genius. The amount of times I've managed to correctly guess what the snake was and it's completely made my day is a little embarrassing, to be honest. But from an approved idea perspective, there's a really easy to understand hierarchy system, and you can become an approved idea if you spend enough time in the community, take a bunch of tests, prove that you have the knowledge. But you might say that's all well and good, Kelsey, because that's snakes, and we're a fandom-led industry, and you would totally be right. Changing all of our communities overnight to be purpose-led is a radical overhaul. It's probably just not going to happen just because we decide it's the right strategy. But I think an easy one to think about are the ways that your communities are already naturally engaging. Do they like to help onboard new players? Are they sharing resources with each other? Maybe they're finding people to jump in and game with them. You'll notice that the engagement stays the same, but if you're making your communities to be purpose-led, it's going to lean less heavily on that identity friction point. Suddenly, that slope of purpose is happening. I assume there's not a huge amount of people in the room right now who can actually dictate their company's strategy, though. I would like, if there's one takeaway that you could take from this to whoever it is that you report into, if it's you, I'm talking to you right now. Short-term gain makes a lot of sense to businesses. It's really easy to go, we know by getting this KPI, we're going to get this level of ROI on it. Great. But if we don't start to build our communities with long-term gain in mind, it's not going to just have psychological ramifications. It's not just going to burn our community managers up completely, but but we're going to lose revenue. The toxicity is going to be driving people away. People are going to be disengaging entirely because they just don't want to deal with the level of toxicity. It just makes business sense. That's it. That's me. I've got, I think, a couple of minutes for questions. Do I? I do. 2 minutes.
Hi. Quick question, like about the last part you were talking about. So, in a larger community, is the idea then to create multiple, like, smaller purpose-built ones so that it kind of actually breaks up and people have a better, yeah?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, and I think that you probably already see this happening. Like, there often will be little corners. I like to think of it as a party, and then little corners will splinter off. I think that creating the purpose based on that is a really neat idea. I think that there's no one-size-fits-all approach, though. I think it would really depend on the community itself.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello.
Hi there. Are there any specific gaming communities that you think have that purpose-led structure, and what in particular makes those examples good?
Yeah, I think a lot of communities that do it well are the ones that have it built into them that they're going to help onboard new players, because I think that when that happens, and a lot of MMOs actually do that quite well, is we know that there are toxic corners of this game, and we want new people to join, so we're going to be friendly, we're going to help you get involved, we're going to make sure that you have a good experience. I've seen a couple that have I've seen a couple of Overwatch splinter groups that are formed by a community, less official community managers, and their entire structure is around, we're just going to share tips and things like that. But yeah, the onboarding players tends to be a much less toxic option on the whole.
Gotcha, thank you.
No worries.
Real quick question: Could you give maybe some examples of what are some purposes a gaming community would have? Like, with your snake example, like learning and being passionate about snakes. But is it just passion around a particular game? But what would you define as maybe an example of some of that purpose? And I guess my reason for asking is, is that something that we can introduce?
Yeah.
Or is it something that the community kind of organically arrives at? Because it does feel like a lot of times these community changes are kind of things that us as businesses are kind of powerless. They kind of go in their own direction. Anyway.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I really want to get people to think about is fandom for fandom's sake, i.e. we're going to make a community based on insert game title here, is probably not the way we should do it moving forward. And so your point of potentially getting players themselves to form those communities based on the purpose they're creating is a good idea. The idea of having splinter groups where you're creating under that banner a bunch of different purpose-led communities makes a lot of sense too. But in terms of your question of examples of communities, obviously the onboarding one that I was talking about earlier is a broad example, but within your game itself, you're going to have purpose there, right? And I think that leaning on what the mechanics of your game are, leaning on what it is you're actually trying to communicate within your game will often give you the answers for that purpose, as opposed to just grab a bunch of people who like the game and put them in a room together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Awesome. That's me. Thank you so much.